What up? I'm Josh Paulson, and welcome to Your Story Now. So we're running into this issue where we know the main character, not at all. So as a result, we don't know what they'll do as we continue moving along the story. What do they really need in order to overcome the arrogant villain's lies? Who is this arrogant villain that the main character would have to fight so hard to overcome? We don't have enough information. So what we can do is that we can look at our next technique, which is the beginnings. Now at this point, I would recommend that you start developing out your DAB structure for your character. So our main character is named blank. And then we have the data assessment and we have the backstory. So I'm going to make these into headings. So remember with data, what we look at is, well, who are they? What are the pieces that we want them to have? And we need the main character to be influenceable. And that's a terrible word, but I'm going to go with it right now. Influenceable. Because the main villain ends up berating them, and that is a piece that impacts them. It impacts them enough that they try to prove themselves. So they need to be influenceable. Or perhaps they need to desire to prove themselves. Whatever the case, then we have to ask, okay, what would be required for that? Well, could be they don't feel trusted or believed in. Okay, let's go they don't feel believed in. Then we go back into the backstory of how this happened. This is exactly what we're talking about with this brainstorming technique. How did it begin? So how did the desire to prove themselves begin for the main character? Perhaps they were fought all the time on the playground, and as a result, they really felt insecure about who they were because they could never really overcome. So as a result, they are trying to prove themselves now for their feelings of shortcoming all the way back then when they were a kid. So what we've just done is that we have looked at the beginning of how the main character became who they are, which is very, very helpful. Seeing that they have a desire to prove themselves can help us figure out why they would feel so anxious and what else needs to be in place. If they feel like they are generally proving themselves, and of course there's multiple reasons why somebody might feel horrible about themselves and try to prove themselves, etc., etc., but if they desire to prove themselves and they don't feel believed in, this gives us a direction for the rest of the story. They have to not have enough people supporting them. If they have too many people supporting them, then they will in fact feel believed in. And if they feel believed in, they won't go in the direction that we want them to go for the story. So yes, this gives us things that we need to keep from the character in order to develop them into who we want them to be for the story. Knowing the beginning gives you direction for the story and helps you to determine how your character in the present time of the story can move from A to B to C and so on. So we still need to have some information on the villain. So for now, I'm just going to say that their beautiful name is Villain. And then we get into the data assessment backstory again for them. And our question here is really about how they became somebody who would tease other people, who would berate them. Why would they? So the data is that Villain needs to berate people. Or Villain berates people. So our data is that they berate people. So what would be required for them to do so? Well, we can go with them being a mirror of the character if we want. That's pretty common. So it could be that the villain is also insecure. Now, in this case, we're just looking at the villain, so assessment is that they're really insecure and trying to cover that up. So what we have now is an assessment, and now this is, again, how did this start? How did the beratement begin? And we're going back to this brainstorming technique. Okay, so the villain perhaps was teased by older siblings. Now, depending on the severity of berating people, this might not seem like enough. We might need to go into detail on exactly what we mean when we say teased. Does that mean that they told him you'll never amount to anything, him or her? We don't know anything about the villain at this point. What happened exactly? And so, again, we keep going back to the beginning. So, why did that start? Was the house competitive? Could be that the house was very competitive. It could be that growing up, the family was a big warrior family. We could have a lot of different possibilities, but again, we ask, how did it begin? Now, this is in regards to characters, and it's kind of a natural progression as we discussed with the DAB structure. But let's take it to another piece. How did dragon riding begin? Okay, so if we want to figure out how dragon riding began, we can actually use the DAB structure in the same way. Early on, we defined a character as a thing. So therefore, dragon riding, a part of culture, is a thing. So data is that it's riding dragons. That's what dragon riding is. So then we have the assessment of what's needed for that to happen. Well, people needed to try it. And people needed to succeed. And people needed, most likely, to be able to help others succeed so that this could spread culturally. So they needed to be able to teach it. So then looking at some of these, and there's a lot more that we could add, we again get back to the backstory question. People needed to try it. They needed to succeed. People needed to be able to teach it. So, okay, what is required for that? And we're back at the question of how did it begin? Okay, well, maybe there were people who really needed to transport large items. And caravans were way too slow. So maybe the government tested it. The government was trying to get this going because, well, they needed it for war. Caravans were too slow to bring the supplies that the front lines needed. So they were originally using dragons just for transport and for sending across items. Now, this is a very different focus than what you might choose. And there's no wrong choice here. We're developing out our story. It can be whatever we want. It could be that it was originally that dragon riding was for war. It could be that it was just fun. It could be that it was seen as just kind of a funny, goofy thing to do. But here we have the backstory question. And what this is allowing us to do is figure out more about the world, which will help us figure out how the main character, how the villain, and how other characters interact in it. This is still very bare bones, but what this does is that it gives us some piece to figure out, okay, the dragon riding's common, this is something that has been going on for a while, perhaps we don't know how long, we could set that, and it helps us figure out how to piece things in and how to break down these pieces further in the outline.